today we are joined by our senior writer, Russell Hausfeld, out in Cincinnati. What's going on, Russ?
Not a lot, just sweating, getting some frizzy hair up here in my office with no AC.
And we're here with David Nichols down in New Zealand.
Hey.
And I'm
Good to
here
see
in
y'all.
Providence. Yeah. So,
and I guess we're going to be talking about some corporadelic stuff today. Russ has been doing some really awesome work. Research and engagement. I guess this has been an episode that's been in the pipeline for a bit.
Yeah, a long time coming.
Yeah, going back to when you attended that Green Market Summit, right?
Yeah, that was all the way back in January. That blows my mind. Time has flown.
It's like a bit has happened this year.
That's like another universe at this point.
Maybe that's the best way to start things off. Russ, if you're up for it and wanted to just like give us a little bit of an overview or your sense about there, we can just kind of jump into the meat and potatoes after that.
Yeah, so just when I went to that conference, so the conference was in New York. It was in a WeWork, and it was hosted by Green Market Reports. And I thought it was a really interesting thing that probably needed to be covered because I hadn't seen many investor-focused conferences before. Up until then, I'd gone to conferences that were, kind of would dip into like woo-woo territory or were very like map-centric. And this one was all these kind of big names that were coming in from a more like for-profit angle, a more like business-minded conference, and that seemed really out of the ordinary to me, and potentially disturbing.
Sure.
And since then, I feel like more than half of the conferences I'm seeing pop up are investor-focused over the last 6 months, and especially with things going virtual, it seems like that's been a huge focus.
That's what I was going to say. At the point where you don't have the infrastructure requirements and the sort of cost layouts, and it's just everybody on Zoom or Crowdcast or whatever, it seems a lot easier to sort of grab a bunch of VC bros or sort of speculative investors or whomever and say, hey, reach out to the psychedelic scientists, say, what are y'all up to? Are you available for this? The way that we've seen, we can say, quote, experts, people who have recently anointed themselves as commentators or other folks in the space who have flocked to these events to give their opinions. I can only imagine, being at that conference in person as all of these people sort of had to tailor their pitches versus now where it seems much more scattershot. I can imagine that sort of initial wave of just sort of focused, investor-centered content must have been rather different than the other things you'd encountered.
Absolutely. And since then, it's been interesting to see who from that conference has turned into a giant in the space, because when I went, MindMed was only partially on my radar. And they had like a one-on-one kind of conversation. And I was like, oh, this guy seems interesting.
Was that one of the platforms where they had their PR person sort of functioning as the moderator, or was that?
So not in JR's case from MindMed.
Okay.
He was being interviewed by her last name's escaping me, but Brittany. She's a journalist, and she works for, I think, like the UN's cannabis something or other. There, the names are escaping me. But no, but at the conference, yes, there's a PR outlet, KCSU, I think is
KCSA.
KCSA. Thank you. And Lewis Goldberg, he runs the Green Rush podcast. He was the moderator for at least one of the panels where he was the PR person for people on the panel.
Gotcha.
It just felt like an interesting point to observe, a little bit of conflict of interest maybe there, but not really in their case. But everyone was paying for their panels anyway.
Sure. Well, so this gets into these interesting questions that I think we were hoping to initially drill down into about the effects of sort of capitalist dynamics on psychedelic space that has if not largely been free. I mean, right, like thinking about who has donated to MAPS over the years, who has made this research possible, who's funded a lot of these endeavors. There have been a lot of, whether we want to call them titans of industries or just executives from extractive industry and computing, people who've made quite a bit of money on their own. Like capitalism hasn't necessarily been totally divorced from psychedelic science and funding these professionalized endeavors. But the way that the orientation seems to be taking place here, and based on some of the initial reflections you shared and the writing, it seems like the tendrils of capitalism are really wrapping around certain dynamics, certain people. When you say that maybe there weren't so much conflicts of interest, or we wouldn't necessarily call it a conflict of interest per se, but at the same time, all of these people paid for their ability to present about their companies, which they obviously have a vested interest in promoting. I mean, were there other things that struck you about sort of capitalist dynamics in those spaces?
Just focusing on the paying for your panels, it creates this barrier of entry, which was kind of wild. Like you pay $1,000 to basically get on a panel with multiple people. You pay $5,000 to have a full panel that's just what you want to talk about your company, and that creates an immediate barrier of entry to get your information out here to these people who are paying, I think it was like $100 a ticket. It sold out. So
that was $100 a ticket then, and it's now up to like $500 a ticket just for the
their
virtual.
Next one is so expensive. It's wild. And you look at who they say should be there, and it's like C-suite executives and VCs and that kind of stuff. And it's like, that's not the crowd that seems like it has typically been tailored to in this space.
Totally. Well, and if I think back, when I submitted an abstract for MAPS in 2013, presenting on phytochemical data for ayahuasca and other psychedelic preparations, I remember that went through sort of a third-party review setup. They had somebody there to sort of go through the abstracts, decide what would qualify. It didn't matter as far as I knew. I mean, I still, MAPS made us pay quite at the time, a not insignificant amount for me to be there. But putting that aside, it wasn't about pay to play. It was it seemed more maybe intellectually curated or around content rather than, paying the host organization, which again, seems to be focusing more on the money rather than the content, more on the hype rather than, the actual material. And I think seeing, and I think we've all discussed some of our concerns around the sort of stripping out of meaning or the reshifting of focus towards how can you lure investors? Can you generate flash? Can you potentially release PR statements that will drive up value for the companies that have gone public? And I think, as we've had these conversations for a while, many of these seem to be the dynamics that a number of folks in the community have been concerned about for a long time. Perhaps, if not most notably, quite notably, Bob Jesse, who wrote the statement on open science and open praxis with regards to MDMA, psychedelics, entheogens. And I know, Russ, you've written and read a good bit about that. I've engaged with it as well, but maybe if you want to tee us off for some of those issues coming to the forefront.
Yeah. So the open science statement was kind of my introduction to who Bob Jesse was. He just wrote a very idealistic statement about how to kind of cooperatively participate in a space like this that is kind of coming into the industry. And Jesse, we've got here in notes, he's the founder of the Council on Spiritual Practices. He was is a board member at USONA. He was instrumental in forming the psilocybin research team at Johns Hopkins and was
he's involved at Hefter too.
Yeah. So he's just deeply involved in the space. You know a little bit more about him than I do, but very idealistic guy. And the open science statement was really this kind of way to keep people in check in the space.
Yeah,
If
and
people cooperated, right? Like
Mhm.
if people came together. And just a quick point, Normie, one sec, just pointing out that like some people certainly viewed it as idealistic. I don't think it's wrong to call it idealistic, but we could also say, you know, in some ways, living in a society where everything is for sale and everything has a price, the notion of having some of these moral and ethical lines, it's like that becomes seen as idealistic.
Sure.
When you say, actually, this is my line in the sand, this feels wrong to me, then you
Mhm.
get a bunch of other people saying, oh, come on, that's not realistic, that's idealistic. Business as usual is inevitable, it has to charge forward. Certainly you can't, you know, this is just a moral stance and isn't gonna have any real impact. But it's like, if we don't act from some sort of moral compass, sort of where do we find ourselves?
Right. And
Sorry.
what's great about the statement is that it got, I mean, 134, I think, is the number that I've last seen, individuals and organizations that signed on to it. So regardless of if it was, I don't know, if it was going to work or not, it still provided a great kind of document to check people on as things move forward. And as you've pointed out in numerous occasions, people have kind of, it seems like people have kind of gone off the rails of the statement a little bit.
Sure. Well, and something to throw out there, you know, I remember when I saw the statement, which for those unfamiliar, it pretty much had 4 principles. That was, they were dealing with intellectual and scientific integrity, which was basically that research would be presented as discovered. You know, there's a lot of folks doing psychedelic research who feel invested in that, either because of their own experiences or practices, and want to propagandize, promote it, what have you. I don't mean propagandize in a negative way, so to speak. But like we've seen, say, with issues of sexual misconduct, this notion that people in the field need to keep quiet because not keeping quiet could jeopardize the research. And so not that this first pillar was put there just for that, but in order to remind people that like there's an obligation to sharing information as it is, so that we can learn and grow and adjust our understandings together. You know, the second pillar was that folks, as much as it may be necessary to get paid for their services and all of that, that the focus should be on working to be in service, and that signatories would ultimately place the common good above their own private gain. The third pillar was the notion of open science and open praxis, which was that signatories wouldn't withhold or require others to withhold any sort of materials or knowledge for commercial advantage. So that gets into the whole intellectual property, patent warfare, this notion of privatizing. And even if you think about things that happen in a private company, where you can do studies that you don't patent or release or make public, you just don't share that information with anyone. That really dampens what we can engage with and understand collectively. And the fourth principle was non-interference, which again said that signatories would strive to place discoveries into the public domain for the benefit of all. If there are patents or other IP, that they'd be licensed for no more than reasonable, like covering administrative costs and the like. And that ultimately the point was to be in alignment with those principles of sharing, collaboration, working for the betterment of humankind. And I think if we take those 4 components, it also evidences a certain spirit of the document, which we'll come back to in a moment. But in looking at the notion of putting together a document like this and getting folks to sign it, when I looked at the initial signatory list, I was curious to see how people were going to uphold certain things. I mean, at the point where I first saw the statement, I was familiar with MAPS's work with the militaries, with the military on different fronts, both for veterans, as well as I think an attempt to work with active duty hunter-killer drone pilots back in like 2015. I think that stalled out. But again, wondering how we conceive of working for the collective good of humankind and things like that at the same time that they're potentially reinforcing militarism and US imperialism and the narratives that can accompany that. I was really curious to see how MAPS was going to uphold that, and would we see sort of what I think Bob describes as a collaborators club or cooperators club, and people working together around this. So it's interesting, it's fascinating for me to hear that, like, this sort of cropped up on your radar, and you saw folks that were signed onto it, and I'm curious, I guess, watching some of that play out, or recognizing that as a thing. Did you think that it was likely to meaningfully affect the field? That did you think people would, I don't know, practically engage with it?
I would have liked to have thought that. I feel like the first time I read it, I was like, oh, this could be really cool. To be honest, I think when I was first introduced to it, I had no idea what was coming on the horizon. So,
sure.
Yeah. And
Right.
I think it should probably be noted that Bob didn't just kind of like pull this out of nowhere. He kind of saw these corporations moving in. Just kind of on the peripherals, it seemed that he was aware of Compass, at least Compass Pathways and things like that.
And it seemed like he was talking with quite a few other people around sort of pulling this together, as far as I understand from the different public discussions about who signed and why, and seeing people post on Facebook about their own reasons or their own concerns. Or
right.
You were gonna say.
Yeah. We signed the statement. I signed the statement back in April of 2018. That's when it came on my radar. That was the
How
same.
was it introduced to you?
I think I saw it somewhere online.
Okay.
And I messaged Bob and I said, hey, sign us up. Yeah, but that was around the same time that Compass was kind of starting to make waves, where there was dissent within the community about their practices. A lot of that started happening in early spring of 2018. I think, like what you were saying, the dynamics in the space were shifting quite a lot around that time. I think that can be, as you wrote in one of the pieces on our Psychedelic series, it was a plea for decency.
Yeah, and one of the things, one of the quotes from Bob from, it was a CIIS conference. Dave, you were on the panel there too, I believe, the political and cultural perspectives in psychedelics. Bob said, there's a whole wonderful, awful toolkit available, and I have to believe as a starting assumption that if there is a venture capital-backed entity coming into the psychedelic space, and that they will use all of those available tools unless they promise not to. So I think that, for me, that summarizes kind of the intent that I saw behind the statement.
Totally. Yeah, and I can relate with that to that in a big way. I mean, for me, I've certainly been accused of being an ideologue at numerous points, and if that makes people feel good to say, if that becomes an easy way to sort of pigeonhole and ignore moral and ethical questions, okay, I think that there's some real interesting fundamental questions about human relations and social organizations that spring up around this. And actually, having seen the open science statement and having thought about sort of where it was going to go and whether or not it was written in order to see if people would follow through with actions that aligned with their words, when I started really learning about some of what Compass was up to, I wrote a public letter on Facebook in which I tagged pretty much every person I could find on Facebook who had signed on to the statement. And at the time, in that open letter, I didn't make any real strong assertions. In fact, I stripped out most of the statement, and I left the question. I stripped it all the way down to the bare minimum in order to really ask questions about what is going on materially. I said, look, I've got my own opinions about whether this was right or wrong, or whether or not Compass should be able to do these things. I said, but y'all are the people who have signed the statement. Y'all are the people who have put yourselves out there publicly and said, this is important to you. And I actually limited the statement to essentially the bit that said, we will place the common good above private gain, and we will work for the welfare of the individuals and communities served. And the reason that I stripped it down to just asking what researchers thought about that clause and whether or not Compass's behaviors and MAP's willingness to work with Compass and give them cover and legitimacy in the space violated that clause was because there were a number of conversations I'd been having at the time around sexual misconduct in psychedelic spaces. And I could see the sort of verbal contortions and mental hoops people were jumping through in order to sort of, if not say behavior was acceptable, at least avoid saying behavior was unacceptable. And so to me, it seemed quite clear that people were willing to play these semantic games. And given that, I figured, look, at the point where this statement says, you know, we will neither withhold or require others to withhold materials or knowledge, you know, I could totally see a world where some researcher says, oh, I'm justified in helping these people out because, you know, even though I know that they're going to function as a private company and do the sort of business as usual tactics of IP strategies. Whoop, so what?
No, I just said, and what do you know?
Yeah, what do you know? That's exactly what happened. But you know, even on top of that, it was like the notion that people would view signing the open science statement not as a moral commitment to attempt to fulfill the obligations or requests or suggested not dictates, but like the suggested sort of arrangement of that document, and would instead say, gee, I signed on to this just to like virtue signal to a bunch of people, this is where I'm at. But in reality, I'm looking for any way around it. I'm looking to sort of benefit myself, even as I say I'm putting the community first. To me, it seemed very similar, and I made the point, to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, where the point of that treaty is not to say, gee, can we put something in place so that we can sort of go around back and make sure everyone has nukes? The point is to avoid proliferation of nuclear weapons. The point is to act in ways like it doesn't make sense to sort of aid and abet somebody who hasn't signed on to the NPT just because you have, saying, well, they haven't signed, so I can help them out. It's like that defeats the point of non-proliferation. And so I put this question to the researchers that and advocates and organizations that had signed the statement to say, hey, what do you think about this? And this was leading up to the conference that you mentioned. And sure enough, nobody bit publicly, really. There wasn't the kind of discourse I'd hoped for. So leading up to the conference, I wrote a statement alleging that at the very least, Bill Richards, Rick Doblin, and MAPS were in breach of the statement. I at this point, I want to be clear that, like, I also think that the MAPS Public Benefit Corp and you know, other researchers were also in violation. At that point, it felt worthwhile to keep the assertion relatively small in order to keep things focused, sort of minimize cross chatter and objection, because there was certainly enough objection to my asserting that MAPS and Bill and Rick were all in breach. But, you know, at the end of the day, like, if the point of this this statement was to hamper organizations like Compass from coming into the space, it really required people coming together and saying that we won't help them, saying we understand that the point of the statement, the spirit of the statement, is to keep the corrosive corporate dynamics out of the space, and we will work to those ends. And I think that's led to a lot of disingenuous, oh, for-profit just means this, nonprofit just means that. You know, back to the semantic wrangling of we're talking in a very sort of legalese, strict definitions of certain terms, rather than asking what are motivations and the arrangements.
Yeah. And in the piece you're talking about right now, talking about Bill Richards, Rick Dovlin maps, you were kind of saying that they might be in breach for working with Compass, who did not sign on to the statement. That's correct, right? Compass did not sign the statement. So what were the assertions of how did they breach it in your opinion?
Sure. So I think this goes back significantly to the whole point of the spirit of the statement, right? The notion that the point of the open science statement was to ensure that people are working for the communal good, and something that, as I just mentioned, sort of the corrosive effects of corporate actors. Now, I say for profit, I say corporate. When I say these terms, these are not necessarily, I don't mean these things in the strict definition of for profit, where like a local, single family practitioner, a doctor that has their own practice, or a therapist that has their own practice, who, some people would say, oh, they need to make a profit at the end of the year, so they're operating for profit. Sure, fine, whatever. When I say for profit or corporate, I'm using that as shorthand for the sort of really fucked up cluster of symptoms that we see in business as usual corporate capitalism, the externalization of all sorts of components, the prioritization of profit and shareholder enrichment, the fact that we ultimately see money over everything in systems where things become for sale, where things are commodified, in systems like capitalism, where even your regulatory agencies can be bought out. Say, if we look at environmental regulations, if I'm running a factory and I crunch the numbers and I see that I can actually save money by, if retooling my factory would cost $5 million, but dumping my waste, right, and violating whatever sort of Clean Waters and Streams Act, if that's even still in existence at this point, will only result in $1 million fine, then rather than retooling my factory for avoiding that runoff, I can just dump that stuff, know that year after year I'll pay that $1 million fine, but I'll still have that additional, $4 million coming from not having to retool and run a cleaner factory. So those sorts of really damaging and destructive dynamics are at play throughout every level of capitalism, in my opinion. We see this with climate change. We see this with the unfolding pandemic. We see this in the racism that has been necessary in order to construct capitalism in the US and break down class solidarity between Black folks and Indigenous folks and poor whites, or poor Europeans at the time, going back, hundreds of years. And so the fact that capitalism has these structural components was quite concerning to me. And I felt like it doesn't matter, people were saying Katya and George of Compass Pathways were really nice people. And one of the points I made is it doesn't matter how nice they are. They have to play by certain systemic rules. They have to play according to the logic of the game. And so I asserted in the breach that Compass is unable to sign the statement because they're unable to put the collective over personal profit, because that's how corporations function within capitalism. And then, given the structural nature of Compass, whether or not it wanted to sign on the statement and whether or not they were really nice people had nothing to do with it. As an aside, George Goldsmith came from a background of regulatory capture where he worked with,
before we get into Tapestry, though, just to be clear, at the time when Open Science came out, Compass was running an interference campaign in the community in the form of an exclusivity agreement that they had with a GMP psilocybin manufacturer called Onyx, and they basically were attaching to their supply of GMP psilocybin strings. So if you wanted to use their psilocybin, there was strings attached. So they were in a position of power at the time. With all that, so that
absolutely.
was sort of like the underlying impetus for, I would say, for writing the statement. Even though Bob doesn't say that was what was going on at the time in the space.
Totally, and
which
so
wasn't really public knowledge at all. It was this was what was coming out. This is what people were talking. Hey, this is going on. There was disagreements that were happening between Rick Doblin and other people. Rick Doblin was justifying Compass. They were working pretty closely on a variety of things, sharing connections with the EMA and the FDA.
Rick was speaking for a number of other people, making claims on behalf of USONA and different researchers, and that was not great. And
since
similarly,
then, there's
MAPS
been
was legitimizing. Go ahead.
And since then, there's been a lot of fractures that have happened in the space. All around. One of the criticisms at the time from at least one researcher when the open science statement was being drafted, one of the criticisms was this is going to be very divisive in the community, which turned out to be true. It's not that the statement. It's not that. I'm gonna get there. It's not that the statement itself was what was divisive. Is that the community itself was already divided based on their own values of how the space should move forward in the first place. All the statement did is really kind of bring to the surface what the pre-existing conditions of the space, already were. And I was thinking about this. It's like the open science statement succeeded insofar that it drew a line in the sand, and it failed because it was toothless, and also, and the problem with any of these statements or the problem with all these statements is that there's no enforcement mechanisms at all, of course, but also because for-profit corporations are not going to sign these in the first place.
Right.
And that's one of the problems with any of these statements or pledges or anything like that, is that the people who you're actually trying to regulate that behavior, they're not going to sign it.
Just to be clear, though, I think that was a very different time, 2+ years ago. Granted, it was after Compass had pivoted from nonprofit to for-profit, which they did in a really shiesty way. But aside from that, the reality is MAPS gave them legitimacy. The reality is that had the community come together, had researchers, and this is part of why I wrote Considerations on the Breach, because at that point it was very apparent to me that even then there was still potential for MAPS to distance themselves from Compass, to say we're actually not in favor of these sorts of behaviors, and we're not going to continue to let Compass get legitimacy off the MAPS name. We're not going to let Compass continue to participate in our board meetings and get seen as having been welcomed into the space by MAPS and therefore being okay to engage with. And something that I think is really worthwhile to consider is that in the context of facilitating this sort of justification, Rick has repeatedly said that because he had signed on to open science, he was free to share information with everyone. The problem there is, as we've discussed, that presents a willful ignorance towards what giving that information to Compass results in, how Compass is going to use that. But on top of that, there was a statement, the co-founder and CTO of a company called Think Myco, Nikita Alexandrov, wrote something that he called the 2020 Psychedelic Industry Insight Report. It's posted on Reddit. And in that report, he claimed that the $220 million worth of investable deals in psychedelic space have only existed since the public formation of Compass Pathways in 2016, with the majority leaving stealth mode in 2019. Now, the analysis that he doesn't take to its conclusion is that the only reason Compass was able to blaze that trail, or a significant component of Compass being able to blaze that trail and to switch from their nonprofit to for-profit in 2016, was because they received a whole bunch of assistance from MAPS and other psychedelic researchers, some of whom they duped or took advantage of or had working in these different ways that were then suddenly let go. And to be clear, part of the reason I'm saying duped, and I said they're going public was in a really shiesty way, is because at the ICPR conference in 2016, George Goldsmith made a statement to the effect of, all of these concerns that we have about the future of mental health and this, that, or the other are the reasons that we've set up this not-for-profit sort of mental health company. And then 10 days after that, they filed for for-profit status in the UK via Companies House.
If anybody wants to read more about this, Olivia Goldhill with Quartz wrote a story called "A Millionaire Couple is Threatening to Create a Magic Mushroom Monopoly," and this gets into some of the developments that happened at that time as well.
Well, and I think that it really, that article in particular, a bunch of Russell's coverage has really highlighted the degree to which these dynamics this sort of dynamics of capitalism are now fully at play in the space. But then on top of that, there's like this sick gaslighting where these people coming into psychedelic spaces have some sense that like, there are people who are quite empathic. There are people who are quite concerned with mental health and human well-being here. So we can actually behave in ways that take advantage of that. For example, Olivia Goldhill reported that George Goldsmith was crying at this MAPS meeting after he was asked by Natalie Ginsburg, Director of Policy and Advocacy for MAPS. She asked him, "Can you tell us what Compass is doing to differentiate yourself from other pharmaceutical companies who put shareholders before patients?" Now, it turns out that Goldsmith started crying in response and said, "How can you ask me that? Do you know my track record? It speaks for itself." Personally, I have to call bullshit on that. George Goldsmith.
You stole my words, Dave.
I did?
You stole my words. I was just about to say that.
Oh, well, how could it not be bullshit? This is a man who made a career out of meeting with C-suite executives, high-ranking government officials, regulatory officials, all of these people in these what they called multi-stakeholder meetings, right? Where they're using this thing called Chatham House rules, where they'll acknowledge things that got said, but not who said them. And so when you're running an organization like Tapestry Networks, where you're facilitating all that, you come across very standard industry questions like this all of the time. And to me, it seemed like, we could say it wasn't a softball question, but it certainly wasn't barbed. It wasn't presented in a way that should have been offensive. And the fact that this person with all of these years of history and experience in these spaces would start crying, to me, that seems like clear crocodile tears. And Katya has also broken down into
we know
crocodile
this.
tears.
Yeah, we know this when the founders of Compass have been challenged in any way publicly, they cry.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Which
is, I just love thinking of them like at the helm of like a fracking industry meeting or something, which we've read about Tapestry facilitating, and like getting asked a hard question about regulation and crying with a bunch of industries in like fracking.
Yeah, I wonder if George Goldsmith has cried about the people who lost their houses and everything they owned and after the financial crash, or the people who can set their water on fire after fracking. No, but he cries at a question from Natalie Ginsburg. That is a very legitimate, straightforward, like just basic question. And so that, it's bullshit.
It's total bullshit, and it comes back,
they know, like these companies that are out there, they know that there's an activist community out there. They know that the decrim folks are on their ass, and they try to put, the best message that they can put out there,
Absolutely. Well, and as you pointed out, Normie, like there's this huge tactical strategic component of this where we looked through. So the Harvard Business School wrote a paper dealing with Tapestry Networks business practices, and Normie was super quick. The first thing he pulled out, to my recollection, was, oh, look, there's a section that matches exactly what was described. There was an herb.co, I think, article that was written about what had been going on with Compass, and Dr. Catherine McLean had been very vocal. To be clear, like Dr. McLean was one of the first super vocal opponents of a bunch of what Compass was doing. And when we looked at that Tapestry Networks paper from Harvard and we compared it with the tactics that Dr. McLean said she'd experienced, it was like it mapped on perfectly.
Yeah.
And you could see there was this like parasitic, here, hit us
Well,
with
I, to my knowledge, the first article that came out about this, it was in herb.co from April 18th, 2018. It's called "Will Psychedelic Drugs Become Corporate Like Cannabis?" And Catherine McLean is in that article quite a lot. And basic to what you were saying before, Dave, Compass Pathways, at first they were a nonprofit. And so what they did is they spoke to Rick. Rick is, Rick's the first person that, you're going to go to. And they basically, then they went to Catherine and they got some very legitimate players in psychedelic research. And so what was funny when in the Harvard Business School in the case study, they described that mechanism. They described how they identify a network and how they infiltrate that network. And
flip individuals in the network, right, into advocates.
Yeah, and so Karthik Ramana, in the Harvard Business School Tapestry document, he writes that when Tapestry sought to recruit new network participants, it focused on particular individuals. It did an analysis of the fastest path to contact through trusted associates to that person and relied on that trusted associate to recruit the individual. Once Tapestry had developed a relationship with these individuals, they would become the network's quote unquote champions, Goldsmith noted. They started building a coalition internally within their firms and then turn the firm or NGO or government agency into a client of Tapestry. And basically in reading that, at that time, I was like, oh shit, like this is exactly what happened here. So it was pretty revealing of their motives. And it was especially interesting that Harvard Business School like actually had a case study. It was like an amazing piece it was like a gem that we found just sitting there.
Well, and beyond that, it's really important to note that Karthik Ramana literally wrote the book on thin political margins, right? These spaces in which essentially what happens is industry says, our industry is so specialized, the only people who could possibly have the understandings to know enough to regulate it are people from industry already. And so you see this incestuous, it's the same revolving door between regulators and regulated and government and private industry that we see in so many aspects of American capitalism and governmental capture and all of this. And yet here was Tapestry Networks saying, we're set up as a boutique firm. We're not a PR agency. We're not, going to be going on to Capitol Hill and doing these things for you specifically. We're here to sort of, we hold what they contend to be neutral platforms to have different stakeholders come together, right? So they're bringing together government regulators, industry heads, different people involved in that. And they say these are neutral platforms, but in many of the cases, the platforms are actually funded by industry, which then gives them a chance to get in the same room with regulators and other people who they'd be interested in reaching. And so seeing the fact that Compass was sort of the one of the first movers and the first mover in a big way when we look at the exclusivity agreement for GMP psilocybin, when we look at the way that they were sort of partnering with MAPS and throwing their weight around. But since then, we've actually seen, at the time it was Compass and then Eleusis, which is a company run by a former investment banker who was involved in all sorts of questionable derivative stuff and Shlomi Raz, right? Now, Eleusis is a benefit corp. That should indicate to folks in the community that benefit corps are not necessarily going to save psychedelic business or prevent it from sliding into the sort of capitalist dumpster fire. But at this point, we've seen an explosion of capitalist players, of for-profits, of corporations, of groups that are very much interested in putting investor profits over all else. We've seen a flood of bullshit PR statements and the like. And I think it would probably be good to do some brief rundowns of some of these corporadelic heads and just get a brief sense of who's on the train. Russ did a really great job of covering a bunch of these in the series.
Before we get to this, I want to point out something important here, in just to put a bow on what we're talking about. So the sheltering that occurred of Compass, it wasn't just, what was driving that was also Rick Doblin's belief in the capitalistic structures that we're going to move in, because Rick believes that that is a sign of progress. A, it's inevitable, but B, it's a sign that within our culture, that this is a sign that we've made it, boys. That this is a sign that that we've been accepted. We are no longer, and Rick talks about this, we're not the counterculture, we're the culture. It was a validation of, let's face it was a validation of 30 plus years of the work that MAPS has been doing. Not just MAPS, but a lot of people out there have been doing. The other point is, I think that we would be, I think we have to say that George Goldsmith and Compass, the founders of Compass, they had donated over $200,000 to MAPS as well. So,
and I
that's
think
also there too.
Between MAPS and Compass too, you could say there was potentially some back scratching on both sides, as MAPS has a lot of connections to regulators in the United States. Compass, through Tapestry and all of that, seems to have a lot of connections to regulators in Europe, which is a place that MAPS.
Yeah, they have Compass has the former EMA head on their board, Thomas Longren, as well. They're
and Longren fell afoul of precisely the sort of lack of regulatory separation that we've discussed, where he was running a private firm at the same time he was the head of the EMA, and
there was revolving door going on there, to which some watchdog groups called him out on. But yeah, I think it's just important for people to realize that, like, this was seen as a validation of the work that had been occurring.
Yeah,
totally. So now when everybody can flood in, and it's, oh shit, none of that was our fault. Don't look at us.
Yeah. So, so that's just it. So perhaps the biggest player on the field at this point is Atai Life Sciences, who we learned from I think CEO Srinivas Rao, that he said this at the virtual psychedelics conference, that Atai was actually set up to funnel money into Compass. Unsurprising, I think something we'd all suspected for a long time, but to have that validated in public was interesting to see. Normie, I know you've got a whole bunch of feelings about Christian Angermeyer.
I think Christian Angermeyer is a shithead. I don't know what else to say. I think he's a shithead. I think he's a batshit libertarian Trump supporter. He called
to end social distancing as early as March 25th.
We ran a couple stories on him. He was all about hydroxychloroquine. He's making an ass of himself on social media. He's just a big libertarian guy. He thinks that technology is going to solve, he thinks technology is going to solve anything. This isn't the magical thinking that technology, any problem, any societal ill in society, that you're going to be able to have a technology. This is in the same camp as that you think we're going to create technologies to solve climate change, instead of realizing that, oh shit, it's capitalism that creates climate change. Which in the current pandemic that we're in right now, we've seen all of the emissions drop quite a lot. We don't need technology. We need restructuring of how we live and how we work. That's actually the solution to.
Well, and even around those emissions drops, people have been very quick to say, A, watch out for spikes as things ramp back up, and B, this has only been in certain sectors, so maybe it hasn't been and won't be as extreme or as significant, even as cities are clearing up and there's, certain visual indicators that actually looking wholesale, unless we start engaging in things like degrowth and sort of reconsidering this mode of endless perpetual consumption. Again, there's not a techno fix to that. There are a finite number of raw materials on the planet. This is part of why we see people starting to pitch mining asteroids and the like, you know. And so Angermeyer definitely comes from that techno solutionist, techno fix background, which leads to all sorts of delusional, I would contend, claims. I mean, in addition to that, he serves on the president of Rwanda's advisory council, Paul Kagame. And Kagame has been accused of all sorts of.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Let's talk about that in a second. I just want to talk just some foundational stuff here about Atai. They describe themselves as, from their website, as the biotech company to heal mental health disorders and a platform for innovation focused on depression, anxiety, and addiction. I specifically love the word innovation there because I don't think it's that innovative when you don't even mention any of the systemic causes of depression, anxiety, and addiction. All they do is, you know, Angermeyer at every investment pitch that he does or public appearance, he just throws out the 320 million or 300 million people who suffer from this. That's all that he does. It's just frustrating.
Yeah. And I think of Atai as like an umbrella as well. Like they're kind of like the perfect case study of like a holding company in this space where they're this umbrella company which oversees Entheogenics, which is a company that they're invested in, and both monetarily and their executive staff are executive staff at Entheogenics. Inoplexis, which is like a drug discovery company. Neuronasal, which isn't particularly focused on psychedelics. It's like a concussion company. Compass Pathways, specifically, as we've already noted, Atai was basically started to fund Atai for investors like Christian Angermeyer and a good friend of his, Peter Thiel, the co-founder of PayPal, has a good amount of money put into this as well.
And Palantir, and you know, all these surveillance and data. I mean, one of the things we'll talk about on another episode is the encroachment of sort of these surveillance capitalism principles into all of this. And Atai is really structured to sort of deal with both the psychedelic therapies, the data extraction, as Russ just pointed out, like these other, you have predictive analytics and AI in your drug development pipeline. You also have sort of non-psychedelics where you can start spinning these narratives about, oh, we're looking to be a full service mental health, you know, the Google of mental health, perhaps.
Right. The money's in data, and these companies are figuring out how they're going to be able to mine as much data and monetize that data in the future. Okay, so Paul Kagame, let's talk about him.
Well, I mean, at this moment, as the U.S. is seeing uprisings against the cops in all 50 states, I think it's important to point out that in addition to Paul Kagame's,
so just to be clear, he's the president. He's the current president of Rwanda. And he's been the president of Rwanda for 2.5 decades or so, I believe.
New York Times describes him as the global elite's favorite strongman. The Human Rights Watch has called him out for his opponents disappearing, winding up with slit throats, all sorts of human rights atrocities. And he's used the police, the Rwandan police, to, quote, clean up the streets of the capital city, Kigali, essentially by taking very aggressive measures to push out poor folks, street vendors, prostitutes, sex workers, you know, all sorts of so-called undesirables. And on top of that, he's used the cops to jail all sorts of dissidents. His police force has been accused of numerous murders, assaults, really, really shitty behavior. I mean, the kind of things that we expect from cops, and I think the kind of things that are increasingly being more evidenced. So the notion that this guy is being welcomed, warmly welcomed by a number of people within the psychedelic space. Yeah, go ahead, Russ.
Well, I was going to say, what's wild is that this isn't even something that we like dug up. You know, this is something that he's essentially bragging about in his bio in conferences. We found this because in our listed here, it says groups like SciTech are proudly promoting Angermeyer's bio with the fact that he's on the advisory board for Kagame. So it's not even like he is trying to hide this or anything. He's kind of using it to bolster his image. I don't know if he just thinks nobody is going to look into that or
no, because no one in this space is even talking about it. They don't want to talk about it. It's like,
well, people don't care.
They don't want it. It's dirty. It's so dirty. It's
Yeah.
so dirty. They don't want to talk about it. What they want is his money.
Right.
They want his money. And this is amazing to me that MAPS is doing a peace in the Middle East study with MDMA for Palestinians and for Israelis in the conflict there. And Christian Angermeyer single-handedly funded that whole study. My understanding was that he wanted to be the only person who was funding that study. I believe it was a couple $100,000 that MAPS needed to run that study, and he gave that. So literally, there is an MDMA peace in the Middle East study being funded right now for someone who is in cahoots with Paul Kagame, who's running a police state in Rwanda. He's making Rwanda very nice for, Western businesses to get in there. And it's unbelievable to me that Dave, this goes to the point of unity I think that you wanted to make about
well, this has been a long ongoing, I've been pushing back against this sort of psychedelic unity for a long time, right? Where it's sort of like, we all take the same drug, so we're all on the same side. And, no, frankly, we're not. There are really significant issues of race, class, and gender, at the very least within psychedelic spaces. This notion that somehow, as Doblin has pointed or has claimed that, what could possibly be more mainstream than veterans and police officers? I've repeatedly contended that the populations that they're deployed against are unquestionably more mainstream, for those interested in mainstreaming. Beyond that, when we create this notion that we're all equal stakeholders within the psychedelic field, suddenly we start invisibilizing these sorts of class warfare policies that people like Christian Angermeyer undergird. The fact that on the one hand, at the SciTech conference, they asked if people had questions, and I asked a question about Angermeyer's involvement with Kagame and how that factored into improving mental health, how people could coherently assert the same things or those things in the same sentence. And I got booted from the conference, and I came back a few times and asked a few more questions and kept getting booted. Now I understand that those questions make people uncomfortable, but just because people don't want to ask the moral and ethical questions that are clearly staring us in the face doesn't mean they're illegitimate. And these sorts of dynamics, these sorts of notions that capitalism is inevitable, this is just leading to this huge influx. I mean, we've got all these other players to talk about too. We've got, MindMed as another sort of big one at this time. They're almost like the JV version of a tie, whereas like a tie is sort of set up to be doing all of this, potentially like surveillance capitalism based psychedelic therapy, plus all of these machine learning and adjacent pharmaceutical developments and the like. It seems like MindMed is focused on sort of pick a drug, give a reason, raise a bunch of funds, pivot, pick a new drug, give a stated reason, raise a bunch of funds, and pivot. And we've seen that so far with MC18, with LSD microdosing. Now I think they're moving into LSD macrodosing potentially.
Yep. They just launched something called
MDMA and multi-drug modalities. I think they were saying testing LSD with other psychedelics, and what could that be like?
Yeah, so MindMed, they I don't know how recent it was. It's I'm sure it was pretty recent. They just trademarked the phrase psychedelic inspired medicines. And they got the nice TM symbol right on there. That's real, that's what everybody wants to see.
And their founder, Jamon Ran, came from a background of
JR.
He was an Uber executive. Yeah, he likes to go by JR, I guess. He used to be an Uber executive, and before that, he worked at some little trinket company. You know, it was like an app where you would calculate your max trade-in value for whatever sort of little electronics, your phone, the like. You know, it was there to sort of facilitate this perpetual consumerism that's actively killing the planet. Additionally, he was involved in mining and funding resource extraction in Asia, which will tie into a segment we'll go into it in a second.
We're gonna have a whole episode on mining.
Definitely. And it should be noted that when we talk about MindMed 2 and its founding, there's also there's a co-CEO and a co-founder named Stephen Hurst, who I'm not nearly as familiar with as JR, because JR kind of feels like their public CEO. He does most of the speaking engagements. I've seen him most. But just to get this in there, he has experience in Immune Tolerance Institute, the World Bank, and BioVentures for Global Health, things like that. Like I said, I haven't done nearly as much research into him as I have with JR, but it should be noted that there's kind of two people at the helm there, but JR seems to take the lead with the media, at least. So he's kind of...
Yeah, and the other guy that's taking the lead with the media with them is their other investor, Kevin O'Leary from Shark Tank. By Mr. Wonderful, who doesn't know fucking shit about psychedelics, just watch his YouTube channel. It's a joke.
Well, and you know, JR has come out against decriminalization. They've recently entered into a partnership with Liechti Labs that had a whole bunch of LSD related research. And going back to some of the open science principles, when JR was asked about, you know, the research that he'd obtained from Liechti, he commented that, we've learned a lot, but I can't share that with you because we're a public company and there's money to be made.
And that highlights that highlights the spirit of open science that Bob Jesse was trying to lay out right there, because this is the inherent nature of that structure. When you introduce that structure and you replicate that structure in this space, a space that for decades has been an open, collaborative space of universities sharing their research. This is what happens when you go from basically an open source to a closed source system. This is open public knowledge to privatized knowledge.
Well, and on that front too, how many, regardless of the paperwork that they signed for the IRB or anything else, when people did that study with Liechti, how many people envisioned a future where their data was going to become proprietary by some, bullshit private company? And part of the reason I say public company, part of the reason I say bullshit is because the sort of press releases they're making, for example, when they put out a statement, when MindMed put out a statement about developing an LSD neutralizer, a bunch of psychedelic scientists pointed out that hey, this is likely ketanserin, which has been used by Liechti's researchers in the past. It's been used by other folks. It's been shown to be effective, given its activity of 5-HT2A, it's receptor specific, yada, yada, yada. Does this actually have therapist benefits? Are therapists going to want to use it? Many of them
doesn't matter. It sounds good to an investor.
Right. And that's just it.
Right.
This is not being said because it advances science. This is being said because it hypes. It gives a sense of there's value here. There's IP here. This company has something going on that makes sense to buy shares because the value is going to increase. So again, those capitalist dynamics.
I just want to point out that JR has been smashed by decriminalization activists and also, which surprised me, by Rick Doblin. JR told Forbes, quote, "I want nothing to do with those kinds of folks who want to decriminalize psychedelics," and basically nonsensically said that decrim might impede scientific progress, aka jeopardize his profits.
Yeah.
Right. Well,
I think he... go on.
No, you go, Russ.
Just that, not my issue, not my priority. That's what I take away from what he said about decrim, which is it's this new departure from the scene that I've kind of known psychedelics to be a part of, which is... Go on, Brian.
No, you go.
Just that for him to be profiting off of these drugs and to be looking to like make a giant corporation out of this, and to not care about decrim, to not want to be involved in decrim, to say it's not his issue. And there's people in jail right now for for the stuff that he's researching and planning on profiting off of, is disturbing. And he's been continually poked on this issue and poked on this issue. And I just would like to read the most recent thing I've seen from him on this, which was MindMed recently put out a statement kind of about the justice issues going on around the world right now, but about police. But he was poked again about, so what are your, if you really feel this way and you feel like all these people matter, what are your, will you change your statement on decrim? And his most recent tweet as of June 5th was that he's reevaluating and educating my own personal views on decrim through outreach, dialogue with multiple groups, getting there. If we are to end the war on drugs, equitable treatment programs seem most paramount rather than incarceration. So he is continuing a dialogue on that, but he didn't list a single person he's talked to. He didn't list anything constructive there, in my opinion.
Totally. Well, and similarly, as far as Doblin smashing him or whatever, you know, Rick has come out against various, I mean, Rick has criticized Compass, just never when they're in the same room. Mm-hmm. You know, and I don't want to say never, because I'm sure somebody will be able to dig up something, but like, you know, we saw Rick at the, you know, virtual psychedelics conference where he made statements about Compass and MindMed and how overbroad, how Compass's bullshit attempts to repatent Albert Hoffman's psilocybin synthesis were, you know, sort of indefensible, and he didn't agree with it, and this, that, and the other. But then, you know, a week or however many weeks later at the SciTech conference, you know, or the little summit they did before the conference, he was happy to share a platform with Angermeyer and didn't, you know, basically said that he endorsed various things Compass was doing, didn't speak on the patenting issue and all of that, because again, like, these are the folks that currently hold certain not insignificant purse strings for MAPS. Obviously, there's a ton more we could talk about on Atai, MindMed, some of these other players, but we've also recently stumbled across some really interesting stuff tying psychedelics and the emerging psychedelic industry to perhaps the most destructive aspect of global industrial capitalism, which would be mining and extractive industry more broadly. And by that, we mean, you know, mining, oil drilling, fracking, the refining processes needed for this, all of the industrial waste that's produced by this. I mean, these are incredibly destructive processes, not only ecologically, but based on the way that they exploit labor, the people that are made sick from this. I mean, if you look at a history of Koch Industries, for example, and some of their extractive projects, and the degree to which they've fought against healthcare for workers, for people who have seen massive benzene exposure, it's a really fucked up industry. And Russ, I know we've been talking about this for a while. We've got a number of companies that pop up. You know, MindMed even used a reverse takeover with a gold mining company in order to go public and avoid all of the paperwork of going public. And that's just the sort of, not just this sort of, but that's a bizarre connection there. But there's a whole bunch of
JR's me onto this whole thing was the two things initially turned me onto this, just kind of synchronistically, was that MindMed did a reverse takeover of a gold mining company to go public as a psychedelic company. Just seemed like a bizarre thing to happen. And when I was writing that Corporadelic series too, the one thing that I thought just was kind of a hilarious point that I never realized would expand to something larger was that Ronan Levy, who founded Field Trip, is also a gold dealer at Toronto Gold, to my knowledge, still. I think he still is. So just like a bizarre random connection that led to kind of a thread that has not stopped unraveling.
Totally. I mean, we had seen before that George Goldsmith's connection to fracking via Tapestry. When we were looking into JR, I stumbled across the old, the web archive page showing him engaged in mining interests in Asia. But then you went a little bit deeper, and we're going to talk about this much more in depth in another episode. But can you give us an overview of like Ais Resources and then sort of some of the other smaller, firms involved?
So the company that's really standing out to me is Ais Resources, and that is a Canadian mining company. They're invested in mining operations, particularly in Panama for manganese and the Argentinian lithium triangle, which you can look that up. There's plenty of little graphics of where that is in Argentina. But the lithium triangle happens to be in a place that has a water scarcity. AIS is a company who has been directly protested by indigenous people in Argentina over these water scarcity issues. Lithium mining takes massive amounts of water. And so this is a company that has a history of being in places that are having issues with these extractive resources. Turns out that alumni from this company, people who were in their C-suite kind of executive positions, have gone on to found psychedelic corporations. So we've got, and I know we'll get into this more later, but Think Myco, which is a like mushroom focused company. They want to develop mushroom growing technology, nutraceuticals, and eventually pharmaceuticals, which seems to be a strategy with a lot of these companies. They have a nutraceuticals arm that they hope to fund their pharmaceutical arm in the long term. And the founder of Think Myco was the CEO of Ais Resources between 2016 and 2018. And he was the CEO of a lithium mining company called Ultra Lithium for 7 years before that.
That's Mark Enright Morin.
Correct. Yes. And then you look at the co-founders of Think Myco, and they have just as kind of strange connections to these extractive industries. You've got co-founder and chief scientific officer Brian Bapty. He's the former president of Confederation Minerals, which is based in Canada. Then you have co-founder and chairman Bradley Berarda, who was he founded Canico Resources and Continental Gold, which are two resource extraction companies. And the other group that has come out of AIS Resources is Roadman Investments Corp., which they kind of came onto the scene in 2019. They have invested in a number of companies, including Champignon Brands, which I don't know how on the radar they are for your typical person interested in psychedelics, but at least in the investor community online, they get a lot of talk. They recruited Decrim organizer Kevin Matthews to be on their advisory board. He was formerly the campaign director of the Denver Psilocybin Initiative. He currently directs Spore, which I don't know a whole lot about. But Matthews is no longer advising for them. That should be noted. He told me that. And they also founded the Denver Psychedelic Conference, which seems to be another investor-focused psychedelic conference. But Luc Montaigne, who is the CEO of Roadman Investments, has a history at AIS Resources. He also has a history of being the vice president of corporate finance for AIS, he was the VP of corporate finance for AIS, and he worked also for a company called the iMining Group. So he has a long history in mining as well.
Sure.
And then the funniest thing to me about Roadman is that they were formerly a company called Urban Select Corp., which was a resource extraction focused company. Luc Montaigne kind of took over, and they changed their name in April of 2019 from Urban Select to Roadman Investments Corporation, and just started kind of assuming the image of a psychedelic focused investing company. That's what they promote on their website. That's kind of how they promote themselves. All the press releases coming out about Roadman are psychedelic related. But they're still invested in their previous resource extraction projects. They own 100% of a lithium mining company. And So it's bizarre to see a psychedelic company that is also directly invested in this extraction space.
Well, and maybe not so bizarre given their tone deaf selection of Roadman as the name for their company, you know,
Yeah.
and questions about
and that was something that totally went over my head when I first learned about them. Can you where does Roadman come from?
So my understanding is that ties into like indigenous peyote practices, dealing with indigenous Americans. So there would be a rather sort of, you know, it's like we see extraction not just in their mineral endeavors, but also in their naming, in their approach to the space, in their attempt to sort of flash, ooh, we're of this, even as we take, you know, from indigenous identity and community and understanding engagement with these things. And I think that, you know, when you asked him about how they came on the name, it was every bit as revealing as, you know, all of the shit that they're up to. If you want to share.
So this was Montaigne, Luke, the CEO. He said, "I didn't like the name Urban Select. Psychedelics, I believe, is going to be the next wave of excitement and development. Cannabis had its fun for a few years and it's overvalued and quiet now. Currently, the money is in psychedelics, we believe." So intentions right there.
It sounded good.
They just see a bunch of money in it. Yep. And it's notable too because the company that all these guys are coming from, AIS, is invested in lithium and manganese specifically because they see these resources as the next big wave. Like, these are guys who are just looking at the horizon wherever it is, where there's money, and going that direction. The lithium, the manganese for electric batteries, things like that.
Right. I was going to point that out.
Electric cars.
And that there's a huge parallel, right, between, you know, as we see MindMed, Atai, Compass, all these people saying, ooh, we're here to do good for mental health. We want to be here and promote all of this, doing all of this real shit in supposedly in pursuit of some sort of humanitarian aims. It's the same way with these resource companies saying, ooh, we want to help with the creation of electric cars and this, that, and the other. And yet the vast majority of the waste and the ecological destruction from electric cars comes in the manufacturing process, you know, comes from the mining and refining for the batteries, for the manufacture of the car itself, for the production of the car itself.
The question I have is, are they going to use their psychedelics to heal the mental health problems they've caused the people in these communities that they've extracted from?
Oh, don't think about that. That's not connected. That's not possibly connected. What are you doing?
If they can afford it.
And that illustrates a theme that we've been talking about for so long here, you know. That the people they encapsulate as a case study, they get you on the, you know, and they get you on the way in, the harms that they cause, they get you on the way out, treat you for mental health, you know, fuck up your water supply, fuck up community dynamics, rip minerals from the earth, and then claim to want to heal your mental health and sell you,
if you can afford
and sell you mushroom jerky and some nutraceuticals.
So you know, AIS clearly presents like this really fucked up and sort of large scale lens to look at this through, which as we've said we're going to do. But there's a bunch of other companies that all have connections, and the degree to which we see these sort of structural or systemic contradictions between stated aims and purposes and real world behaviors. You know, this is one of the reasons why I think some people view some of our analysis or engagement as sort of coming from radical killjoys, but it's like there's real issues with the narratives that are being presented, and as more people cram into the space, the degree to which these narratives fall apart, it just becomes increasingly apparent. And Russ, if you wouldn't mind taking us through some of these other companies, it just feels like there are moments where we sort of check in with each other, and it's like there are laugh or cry moments, to be clear, but like the sort of laughing at the absurdity of, oh, look, I found somebody else who's engaged in psychedelics and mining. Here we go again.
I feel like I texted the group at one point that if you just look at any of these big corporations that are forming and you type their staff's name into Google alongside mining, like maybe 30% of the time you'll find a connection there on their LinkedIn or whatever, just to this industry. A couple more, just to run through a couple more of the connections. Psyched Wellness is a company that it's sort of off the radar right now, but they went public through reverse takeover of Duncan Park Holdings Corporation, which was previously focused on exploration and mining of gold and precious metals in Canada. They've retained staff for their psychedelic operation. Field Trip Psychedelics, we mentioned Ronan Levy, he's a partner at Toronto Gold. Numinous has their chief financial officer, was on the founding team of the gold mining company Rio Alto Mining. And the one that I guess I'm most kind of saddened to see is that even the MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelics, has ties to resource extraction through what was disclosed in a recent Bulletin article. The precursor for their MDMA is catechol, which is derived more than likely from crude oil. Catechol being a bulk chemical that's produced through crude oil.
Right, and there are plant sources.
But they said crude oil in the article, that it's most likely.
There are plant sources for it. When we followed up with MAPS, all the indications that they gave us, they seemed quite intent on indicating that it was from some form of petroleum derivative. And sure enough, like there is plenty of confirmation that there are significant quantities. It seems like perhaps the vast majority that's used in commercial manufacture and syntheses would come from some sort of petrochemical source. Mm-hmm. And there was this really interesting notion, right, that like when we reached out to get a sense of some of the environmental costs of that, we were told that there was no because of the relatively small amounts that MAPS was using, that there wasn't a need for an environmental impact statement.
A legal requirement for that.
Yeah, precisely. And yet also it's like, it reminds me of the meme that Brian Pace likes to use with some regularity, this notion of maybe if we can't have chocolate without slavery, we shouldn't have chocolate. And the fact is that like MAPS couldn't have their MDMA. We wouldn't have that catechol without the processes and destruction, ecological, human, animal, that is required by extractive industry. And so it's like, if we couldn't have the product without extractive industry, to my mind, it doesn't really matter how small this particular use might be. I mean, especially considering that some of the logic as to why they were using catechol rather than sassafras, Brad Burge stated that when they did the research, there wasn't a way for them to sustainably secure saffrol from sassafras at that scale. And so, but it's like, it winds up being this absurdity where it's like, okay, so we can't do saffrol or sassafras sustainably, but is petrochemical extraction sustainable? Like, if these are the terms that you're setting for yourself of some desire to engage with sustainability, like, what's going on there?
So GMP MDMA is going to be made out of oil. You want to wrap there?
I think that makes sense for part one here.
All right. See you later, everybody.